Hi, I want to make a video on the subject of since you don't perceive different changes, and if you don't recognize something, doesn't mean that that change hasn't happened. If you don't recognize something, doesn't mean the change hasn't happened. And I guess this comes down to a phenomenon of awareness of your environment and awareness of different circumstances surrounding reality and perception, and how perception can be very controlling, and how it can be the one thing that dominates us, because all we do have is our psychology. And if we have a false perception, that can be dominating, and that can be something that controls us entirely. And it can be something that completely alters our understanding of what can be really going on. It takes away full context and distorts the the falsity and the lie that we may be living by. And I suppose you can identify this video as a more perception psychology video more than philosophy, but it does come down to philosophy in many circumstances, because it has to do with how we perceive every single circumstance in our perception, and how we our perception, since like I mentioned before, in our psychology is all we have, and how that we interact, and how we react to those perceptions that we have, and how it can be ultimately one the thing that controls us and manipulates us in many circumstances, because it is the one thing that we're living this philosophy through, is our psychology, which is something that actually does exist. So it's something that is important in the end anyway. So yeah, sometimes you may, I guess the main point in this video is I want to make is sometimes you may not perceive a change, but that doesn't mean a change isn't happening. Every time you're fighting a battle and it doesn't seem like something's changed, it could just be from your perspective. It can just be because you're looking at it from the wrong point of view. Sometimes you're just rolling with the change and you don't even realize a change is happening. You keep on, say you're making videos on YouTube, you don't feel like you're making a difference. I'm sort of like in my circumstance, I don't really feel like I'm making much of a difference, but I could be making a difference. I could be preaching to the choir. But that doesn't mean the choir I'm preaching to cannot, have an effect on other people and give them a new idea, have them spread the message that I gave them. I may have lightened a bulb in their mind and their brain, and all of a sudden they think of something and they could spread it to other people, and that can be a nice and interesting way to spread the message. It can motivate someone. Even if you're preaching to the same people, doesn't mean the change isn't happening. Even if you feel like, okay, you're spreading the message over and over again, but you don't really feel like there's a change. In many cases, you get caught up so much in the change, you don't even realize how much of a change you're making. Um, Sort of like you can, be making a difference, and gradual change every day doesn't mean that the change or the thing you're trying to accomplish isn't happening. It could be happening. It's just happening at a slow pace. Like I mentioned, you're caught up in the change. You're caught up in the moment and the process. And since you're so caught up in the process, doesn't mean that there isn't something happening. It just means you're um, rolling with the punches, or rolling with you're just going right along with it. Sort of like speeding. You don't really feel like you're moving that fast when you're next to another moving vehicle, because it seems like you're both the same speed. It doesn't seem like there's much change happening, but at the same time, the 30 seconds you've been looking at the vehicle that's been right next to you, or slowly passing you, you've traveled, say, half a mile or whatever it is, or a mile. You've been traveling. Just because your relative position hasn't changed much doesn't mean you haven't traveled far in relative to the ground that you're traveling on. Your axis, the axis which the real meaningful axis for which the distance should be measured, is the one that you're not necessarily recognizing, and could be happening anyway. Even if your relative position, say a direct competitor, is not changing, the change that you've made proportional to where you started off relatively has changed significantly, even though the person that's, say, directly competing with you is, still right next to you. You've made a big improvement, they haven't, but they've been next to you long enough to really make it seem like you haven't made as much of a change, even though you've made a fairly significant change. So that's one thing to consider. Yeah, so it's one of those things that perception can be very controlling. It's one of those things that can really take its toll on you. And it could be, there's so many things that can come with these kinds of problems, cognitive dissonance, not knowing what the truth is, having so many issues with understanding exactly what's going on. It almost seems like it's a schizophrenic kind of thing that we all have to kind of deal with on our own little individual and mutual level, and mix it all together, and it can make things a very confusing, blobby mess in the end. when trying to get everyone's opinion. Everyone has their own opinion. Everyone's entitled to their opinion. If everything's subjective, why should I take your opinion any more seriously than the next guy's? If you're just boiling it down to opinion, at that point, what's the point in hearing your opinion other than saying, oh, I'm so gracious to know that your opinion's positive of me? In the end, I just want to know the facts. If I'm ugly, I want to know if I'm really ugly, not just based on your subjective opinion. Yes, your subjective opinion is your opinion and it's your own perception, but that doesn't mean that it's not just an objective thing that's subjectively different. It's not subjectively different, it's just objectively different. That makes any sense. It's just because it's different doesn't make it subjective. It's just objectively different. And the objective fact is your opinion's different, therefore that's part of the objective statement made by the reality that's actually existing. There's a process controlling your subjective feelings, and that's something that we can attribute objectivity to, is the fact that you're subjectively feeling something different. And that's something that's true regardless of the facts. The subjective feeling or whatever you may be feeling, it doesn't change the fact that it's still something that's existing. There's still something, there's some interaction taking place that's causing something to interact a certain way. So it's one of those things that you can't really ignore. Yeah, I'm just looking at this interesting lighting. Decided to open the blinds in the room to change it up a little bit and do the videos a little earlier. So let's see. Yeah. So no change doesn't mean you're not trying, and that doesn't mean that there actually isn't any change. Like I mentioned before, it could just be a relative thing. Just because you're moving fast and you're looking at something, you have no other relative position. The car, say, is blocking the trees on the highway right next to you, but you can't see the trees, you can only see the car, and it feels like you're not really moving, but you know you're moving, you just don't know how fast, and it doesn't seem like you're moving when you're just seeing something move constantly with you or very slowly past you or past them. You don't really see as much of a difference or a change, but the change is still happening. An objective is still being reached. You're still traveling. You're still achieving something. Sometimes you're just so caught up in the gradual progression that you don't realize just how much of a change that you started off as and where you are now and the big change from there to there. You're just so caught up in it, even if your relative position is so significantly different from where you are now. It's so extreme, doesn't mean that an extreme difference hasn't actually occurred. It's occurred. It's just it's been so long, almost in a way. The length, even though it's been a giant step from where you started off at, doesn't mean that the time's been so significant enough, or at least significant enough that you don't realize, regardless of how big of a step you've taken or how much progress you've made, it doesn't mean anything if the context is completely misconstrued by the fact that it's been so long. So there are a lot of things, like time can distort a lot of things. Sort of like looking at a picture, then all of a sudden, you remember the picture in your mind, but it's slightly distorted from the last time you saw a picture. It's one of those things where it's slightly different. Sort of like when you say, you play you say a saying like, "I went to the store," in someone's ear, and then all of a sudden, by the time it gets back to you, it might be the exact same thing. It might have changed, and then all of a sudden it changed halfway through, and then by the time it got back to you, they all got right back to exactly what you started it as. It can have changed, returned to the same, or it can completely have changed into something else. So it's one of those things that can change over time. The context can change. But yeah, like I mentioned, time can be a great distortion. It can change all sorts of things. Like I was going on that example about the picture taken. Yeah, picture, all of a sudden you see a picture, you remember a picture, but it's slightly different from the last time that you actually saw it. And then by the you look at a picture, and then 12 months pass by, and all of a sudden the picture doesn't look anything like it. You have the base of what, say, a picture looked like, or what a movie you remember it as, but you slightly lose context the longer the more you've distorted it, the more you remember it, you slightly misremember it. That becomes the thing that you refer to back as the initial thing that you viewed it as, and all of a sudden, by the time you look at it again, it looks nothing like you remember. So it's one of those things that constantly changes, and that you lose context the more iterations you go through. Sort of like YouTube, always constantly. It says the more different encoding, process, streaming, whatever it is, that you make a video go through, the more you change the file, the more it gets lost in translation, the worse the quality on YouTube gets. And that's one thing I've noticed in making videos, is that the quality gets worse. It's nowhere near as good. It's nowhere near as crisp or high def or whatever you want to call it. I mean, the camera on this thing's pretty decent, the audio quality, but they downgrade the audio quality slightly, and video quality goes down significantly, even though the resolution's the same, or at least they're saying the resolution's the same, is at least by the options they give you when you choose to watch the video, which is just kind of misleading, but whatever. You guys have to go through some special process to fix that issue. So yeah, so no change doesn't mean you're not something's not happening. I watch, I look at the antinatalist community on YouTube when I'm looking at the progress I may be seeing or not be seeing. Sometimes it doesn't seem like there's a change happening, but there is a constant change. Getting caught up in it, it's very gradual, very slow, and all sorts of things. At the same time, you're still making a difference. Even if it's a losing battle, as long as you're climbing uphill, at least you're changing the difference, at least you're trying, at least you're putting in the effort. That's one thing you could say, at least at the very minimum, that you're accomplishing. If not completely accomplishing something, you're just caught up in it, or it's happening very slowly, or a mixture of all those things. All those additional things can add up to being something that seems like nothing, but in the end it's accomplishing something regardless. So it doesn't mean anything in the end. It's still accomplishing something. And another thing I wanted to touch on is, and it really does just boil down to perception. Not knowing does not mean not knowing. Sometimes you say you never heard of a movie someone mentioned and it was a very famous movie. It doesn't mean it wasn't famous. It just means that the circumstance happened to be the case where you didn't know that the movie was a famous movie, or oh, you didn't have context. You heard about it, but you didn't know it was this named movie, or they mentioned it in passing, but you didn't know the full context. You've heard it this way and that way and the other way, but you never got full context of the full thing in one. You just heard different angles from different points of view. That movie, and you heard, okay, and the name of the movie, but then you heard, say, a scene in the movie, but you never really knew the movie, but now you hear the movie, or any number of things, like a band you listen to, or music, or an art piece, or whatever, any circumstance, a person you've heard of. Say you didn't even know who the president was, then you hear all sorts of names. You hear the person's name, then you hear, oh, he's the president or she's the president. Then you hear all sorts of different angles of context, but you never get the full context. Doesn't mean it's not there. It just means that for some reason the context never really came into whole. It was on your end or other people's end. It was the circumstance. You just didn't happen to collect all that context and understand it fully and understand where it was coming from and going. So it ended up not really collecting into one where you really knew the full context, and you can go from there and understand exactly who it is or what's going on. How, who, what, when, where, why in the end, really. That's the question that you're really trying to answer, the questions. So, I don't know if there's anything else to really go on. So yeah, no change doesn't mean not trying, that there's not really a change happening, that you're not motivated to make a change, or that a change is not happening entirely. There is a change. A good example would be, to use a more specific example, in Mindom, when he makes his tiny chat videos, he's still making a difference, even though it doesn't feel like he's making a difference. Something's happening. He got me to jump on board. Got me to motivated to make videos. The whole community as a whole, I guess, got me motivated to make some videos. I had not much else to do in the meantime, really. And it was a good substitute for whatever else I would have been doing in the meantime anyway. So either that or, making the videos, making different charts, making different ideas, feeling like you're not accomplishing something, but you really are accomplishing something. So yeah, and really in the meantime, it's, even though you don't feel like you're doing something, every change does have a difference. Everything you do has a change, good or bad. It's obviously, if you feel like you're not making a change, it's obviously because you don't feel like you're making the change at least you want. The positive change that you feel like you want to make, that you're motivated to make, at least from your point of view. Because obviously the change doesn't matter if it's against your point of view, because that's the opposition, the thing that's bringing you down. But a change is happening, and obviously a change is happening regardless of what you think. Some kind of progress is being made, some kind of effort on your part, regardless of the progress you make, is being made, regardless of what your perception or what actually is happening. It's happening anyway in the end, and that's really all that matters. So even if you don't feel like you're accomplishing something, you're still doing something, and it might just be boiled down to all sorts of changes happened. You just haven't seen it. Look back and see if that can give you any more context. Look at the relative point of view and relative position of where you were before and where you are now, and see if that's the difference that you've made, as opposed to no difference because you've been looking straight ahead all along and you haven't really looked back to see where you came from. Or look to the side and see, well, let's look over there and see where I am now, and then look back and see, oh, I see exactly where I came from, and the difference is significant. So I think that's all I want to mention. This video's gone long enough. So let me just reiterate, no change does not mean that you're not trying or that no change has been made. You're still trying based on the motivation of the person making the change, or a group, or mutual change as a group or a collective, or, you know, it doesn't mean you're not trying, doesn't mean a change isn't happening. Just see your progress, because a change could be there, you're just not really seeing it. You're not perceiving it. It could be a senior moment in the way of your perception, not really noticing what's exactly going on. There could be a change happening, you're just not noticing it. And a significant one at that as well. You never know. But then again, it could also be exactly what it seems. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's the case in every circumstance. But it's a possibility either way. Or not knowing does not mean not known. Like I mentioned before, I gave some examples on that. So I think I have made enough of this video. If I want to give any more context or any more thorough description of these topics, I can always mention it in another video. So thank you, and until next time, goodbye.